Most of us navigate life operating under a convenient illusion, the idea that we possess a singular, unified executive function. We assume there's a solitary I sitting at the control panel of the brain, making decisions in isolation. Clinical psychologist W.R.D. Fairbairn argued the exact opposite. His object relations theory dictates that the human mind is actually an object-seeking ecology. We are driven, at a biological level, by a need for relatedness. This dynamic model diverges sharply from the rigid, fixed structures of classical Freudian theory. Instead of a strict hierarchy of id, ego, and superego battling for dominance, Fairbairn proposed a fluid system defined by our interactions with others. Crucially, these others do not need to be physically in the room with us. Our moment-to-moment emotional stability relies entirely on our continuous interactions with internalized, non-present entities, our imaginal others. We are going to map the specific mechanics of how the human mind uses these absent or completely imaginary figures to regulate psychological distress. To understand this mechanism, we will examine the data across 3 escalating scales, starting with a low-level cognitive behavioral heuristic, moving to the chaotic fallout of severe attachment loss, and concluding with the deliberate clinical treatment of trauma. The human self is a continuous, dialogical negotiation with ghosts, and whoever controls the dialogue controls the psyche. Social anxiety disorder is triggered by an environmental miscalculation. The subject experiences an egocentric overvaluation of external attention, perceiving that the entire room is actively scrutinizing them. Recently, a popular heuristic known as the invisible guest theory emerged as a coping strategy. Stripped of its internet pop culture context, it operates as a highly effective, rudimentary cognitive behavioral intervention. The mechanic requires a deliberate cognitive override. You actively imagine that every external person in the room is entirely preoccupied with their own non-present entity, an invisible guest standing right next to them. By manifesting these secondary objects, the subject forces a reallocation of the room's attention span. The perceived lines of sight snap away from the self and lock on to the invisible guests. With the perceived scrutiny removed, the brain halts its threat response. The subject returns to a stable, neutral state. By redirecting the focus of attention to an imaginary third party, the subject successfully interrupts the biological feedback loop of social fear. Notice how this differs from traditional avoidance behaviors. Attempting to suppress anxiety or flee the room often amplifies the distress cycle. Actively engaging an imaginal other works faster because it gives the brain a tangible target to process. Manipulating a mental model of a stranger's attention can demonstrably alter immediate biochemistry. This proves a baseline concept. Our internal representations wield immense regulatory power over our physical reality. We can scale this model up to examine a profound psychological threat. We must ask what happens to this internal ecology when a real, deeply ingrained attachment object, like a romantic partner, is abruptly severed. A 2003 study by Davis, Shaver, and Vernon provides the empirical data. By surveying over 5,000 individuals facing relationship dissolution, they mapped exactly how the attachment system behaves under the stress of loss. John Bowlby's attachment theory dictates that when a primary figure is threatened, an evolutionary protest behavior triggers. The subject is compelled to reestablish contact at all costs, ensuring survival through proximity. This chart plots the empirical responses to a breakup across 2 axes, attachment avoidance and attachment anxiety. For subjects scoring high in avoidance, the coping mechanism is straightforward. The subject retreats into compulsive self-reliance, suppressing the attachment need entirely. The anxious attachment profile presents a paradox. When these subjects lose an attachment object, they exhibit a chaotic, hyperactivated dual response that defies logical behavior. First, the data maps a sharp spike in retributive anger. The subject generates extreme hostility and vengeful behavior directed entirely at the lost partner. Simultaneous study records a nearly identical spike as the coercive strategy of affect regulation. The mind is frantically oscillating between aggressive punishment and disarming seduction. It uses whatever emotional leverage it can generate to force the internal object back into external reality. Relationship trauma occurs when the mind's internal working model violently rejects an updated external reality. The resulting friction produces paradoxical, self-destructive acting out. When the external environment fails to provide a relational home for emotional pain, the internal system that requires a dialogue begins to fragment. In this state, the mechanisms we use to make sense of our lives can break down entirely, a condition known as symbolic collapse. In a state of symbolic collapse, emotional pain becomes so severe it is rendered unsayable. The subject is stripped of their ability to even narrate their own existence. The internal ecology shuts down. This poses a critical clinical question. If the involuntary loss of an object causes total dysregulation, can the deliberate creation of a new object induce therapeutic reorganization? Nini Fang's methodological research tests this exact premise. She utilizes imaginal dialogue as a method of narrative inquiry to combat the paralyzing effects of depression. To find an object of relatedness, Fang constructed a rigorous imaginal dialogue with the author Virginia Woolf. Fairbairn noted that repressed traumatic pain is hidden within subsidiary hidden selves. Because the human mind is object-seeking, these hidden parts of the self can only be accessed and processed if a safe object of relatedness is present to speak to. In this framework, the act of reading is transformed into an active, relational undertaking. The reader doesn't just analyze the text, they use the author's specific rhythm and voice to conjure a presence they can speak back to. This is a co-constructed dialogical relationship. The Imaginal Wolf possesses an autonomous consciousness in the patient's mind, reacting, listening, and offering a stable presence. The clinical mechanism of action is precise. By engaging this imaginal relationship, the subject safely bypasses their own defensive barriers. They can finally encounter the unsayable trauma, what psychoanalyst Christopher Ballas calls the unthought known. By treating an imagined author as a literal co-inquirer, the subject successfully constructs a functional emotional safe haven out of pure textuality. We tracked this mechanism from projecting invisible companions to the violent vectors of a severed attachment to conjuring a dead author. A clear principle emerges. Ontological reality is secondary to psychological function. The self is a continuous negotiation requiring a sparring partner. Whether an object is flesh and blood, entirely fabricated, or historically distant, the biochemical and emotional regulatory effects on the brain are identical. By understanding the architecture of our internal objects, we gain clinical agency. We can stop being haunted by them and find